what if I told you that there is a biblical prophecy that describes in detail the moment in which Africa will rise as the greatest power on the planet, and that this uprising marks the definitive end of European and American hegemony? This revelation has been in the scriptures for millennia, but was systematically suppressed because it was not of interest to the colonial empires. Today I will show you the verses and prophetic texts that point to the African continent as the true center of humanity's future. If you want to understand why the West still, if you're so afraid of Africa's awakening, leave a like and subscribe. Prepare your heart, because what you're going to see today proves that the story you've been told is about to be turned upside down. Egypt is mentioned more than 600 times in the Bible, but the implications of these references go beyond what is often realized. The reality is that these mentions are not just geographic. They carry prophecies and promises that extend to the entire African continent. Ethiopia, or Kush, also appears more than 40 times, and its importance is underscored by repeated biblical statements about its future role. For centuries, these passages were neglected or distorted, often to justify European colonization and domination over to Africa. European theologians over time interpreted positive prophecies about Africa as having already been fulfilled in the past, or as mere spiritual allegories, never as literal predictions of a great future. On the other hand, prophecies about Europe, Israel, and the West were always taken as literal and central to the history of humanity. The facts reveal that this difference in interpretation was not a matter of theological perspective, but a deliberate strategy to maintain the status quo of domination. If we accept that the Bible predicts the rise of Africa, then we must also accept that European hegemony is temporary. The thought that Africa, the cradle of humanity, could one day resume its central position in the world is something that has historically generated discomfort, as it implies that the power structures built on African exploitation are destined to collapse. Thus, the solution found was to ignore or reinterpret these prophecies, teaching that they do not matter, that they are symbolic and have no practical relevance. However, it is no surprise that Africans, over the centuries, have maintained a different understanding of these passages. For them, the words of the Bible were read with hope, seen as promises of a future where the continent would regain its prominent role. This hope was never just a spiritual consolation, it was a silent resistance, a firm belief that what God promised, He will fulfill. And while the world focused on other regions, Africa continued to believe that its rebirth was written in the stars. History reveals that the Eurocentric interpretation of Scripture has served as a tool of subjugation, but there is also a growing recognition that these prophecies deserve a re-evaluation in light of African history and culture. As African voices become more audible on the global stage, there is a rediscovery of biblical narratives that place Africa in the spotlight. This rediscovery is not just about recovering a lost identity, but about reaffirming a future that many believe is inevitable. So the question that arises is, if Africa is destined to rise, how will this shape the world we know today? Will a return to global center stage bring a new era of justice and equality? The answer may lie in the very faith and resilience of a continent that has long waited for its moment of rebirth. The truth is that biblical prophecies related to Africa, especially those involving Ethiopia, have been underestimated or conveniently reinterpreted over the centuries. Psalm 68:31 speaks of a future in which Ethiopia stretches out its hands to God, a gesture that could symbolize both a spiritual awakening and a political rise. History reveals that over time these words were seen as metaphors, but today, with the economic growth and cultural influence of the African continent, the literal interpretation gains strength. Ethiopia, an ancient nation rich in history, has always played a unique role in biblical and spiritual narratives, being one of the first to adopt Christianity as its official religion. What few realize is that Isaiah 18, with its mention of the land of humming wings, describes a nation that many believe to be Ethiopia, or possibly sub-Saharan Africa. This text speaks of envoys crossing the sea, a powerful image that can refer both to the historical past of African trade and influence and to future global mobilization. The description of a feared, smooth-skinned nation is often associated with the strength and beauty of the African people, characteristics that not only defy stereotypes, but also highlight the importance and latent power of the continent. The facts reveal that Africa's economic growth is remarkable, with a significant increase in GDP and a growing middle class that challenges the narrative of stagnant continents. Furthermore, Africa's young population is an invaluable resource, promising dynamism and innovation on the global stage. Spiritually, the rise of Christianity in Africa is a phenomenon that cannot be ignored. While Christianity faces decline in other parts of the world, in Africa it flourishes, bringing with it a renewed sense of identity and purpose. History demonstrates that as world powers continue to intervene in African affairs, often under the guise of aid or development, there is a growing awareness that such actions are aimed more at containment than genuine support. Africa's spiritual and political awakening represents a threat to the Western status quo, which has historically benefited from the continent's division and exploitation. Thus, prophecies that were previously seen as allegories may be materializing before our eyes. It turns out that these changes are not just economic or demographic. They are profound spiritual and cultural changes that herald a new era. Ethiopia, with its rich Christian tradition and historical legacy, may well lead this African Renaissance, symbolizing the fulfillment of biblical promises. Meanwhile, nations that ignored or underestimated Africa must now face the reality of a continent that is asserting itself on the world stage. So the question that arises is, are we prepared for a world where Africa not only rises up, but redefines global dynamics? The answer may well lie in the scriptures that long ago predicted a great future for this continent. How is it possible that a conference in 1884 shaped the destiny of an entire continent for more than a century? The Berlin Conference, which took place between 1884 and 1885, was not just an exercise in unbridled imperialism. It was a calculated geopolitical maneuver to ensure that Africa would never achieve its potential as a unified global power. European leaders, driven by a deep and perhaps unconscious fear, feared what Africa might become if its abundant natural resources, vast populations, and fertile lands were harnessed collectively and strategically. What few realize is that this division was not just about economic exploitation, but about disrupting a potential prophecy, that of a strong, unified Africa. The reality shows that the division of the continent along arbitrary lines, without considering the complex ethnicities, cultures, and local governance systems, has sown discord and conflict. Puppet governments and internal rivalries were intentionally fostered to weaken any sense of continental unity. These acts not only facilitated colonial control, but also created social and political wounds that would take generations to heal. The divide and conquer strategy was so effective that many of the conflicts and instabilities seen in modern Africa can still be traced back to the borders drawn in Berlin. However, facts reveal that history is not written in stone. The African Union, established in 2001, has worked tirelessly to reverse the damage caused by decades of colonization and division. It turns out that domestic economic cooperation, through agreements like the African Continental Free Trade Area, is beginning to flourish, promising a future of greater autonomy and sustainable economic growth. Furthermore, many African countries have renegotiated or rejected harmful agreements with foreign powers, seeking development models that respect both African sovereignty and dignity. Evidence points to a cultural and spiritual renaissance that is fueling this transformation. Young people across the continent are rejecting colonial narratives and reconnecting with their ancestral roots. They are revisiting history, valuing their indigenous languages, and rediscovering authentic spiritual practices. This cultural awakening is not just a resistance movement. It is a reaffirmation of identity that challenges the global status quo. Documents prove that global powers are still trying to maintain their dominance over Africa through political and economic interventions. Coups d'etat, often orchestrated or supported externally, and civil wars are used as tools to maintain instability. Likewise, unpayable debt structures and impositions of economic policies limit the continent's autonomous growth. But these strategies are becoming increasingly unsustainable. The history reveals that as Africa awakens to its potential, the world watches with apprehension. Biblical prophecies, often neglected or reinterpreted, seem to gain new relevance in light of these developments. Ethiopia, mentioned as a symbol of ascension, is just one example of how these ancient promises may be beginning to manifest. The question that remains is, how will the world react when Africa finally awakens and claims its rightful place on the global stage? How is it that Africa, so long seen only as a continent of exploration, is becoming the epicenter of global change? This is the question that many begin to ask when observing economic, technological, and spiritual movements on the continent. The truth is that, while the world was distracted by other conflicts and geopolitical tensions, Africa was silently sowing the seeds of a revolution that promises to transform the global balance of power. The facts reveal that, amid growing dissatisfaction with dependence on foreign currencies, many African countries are adopting local currencies and developing their own digital payment systems. This movement not only strengthens the domestic economy, but also challenges the supremacy of traditional global exchange currencies. Countries like Kenya, with its innovation in mobile payments through M-Pesa, are already demonstrating to the world how technology can be adapted to respond to local needs effectively, challenging traditional financial structures. Furthermore, China's influence in Africa is undeniable. With trillion-dollar investments in infrastructure, roads, railways, and ports, China is not just building, but creating deep economic ties that will secure its position in the African market for decades to come. It turns out that this Chinese interest is not mere altruism. It is a calculated strategy to guarantee access to resources and markets that will be crucial in the 21st century. Africa, with its young and growing population, represents consumption potential that no other region can offer on the same scale. What few realize is that technology companies are using Africa as fertile ground for testing innovations. With a population that quickly adopts new technologies, the continent has become a living laboratory for advances that are later launched on global markets. Examples such as the expansive use of drones for deliveries in rural areas, or the implementation of blockchain technology to ensure authenticity in supply chains, show that Africa is not just a passive participant, but an active catalyst for innovation. Spiritually, the dynamic is also changing. African churches, which for centuries received missionaries from the West, are now sending missionaries to Europe and the United States. This missionary reversal movement symbolizes a new era of cultural and spiritual exchange. Reality shows that while Christianity faces challenges in many Western countries, it is flourishing on African soil, bringing with it new interpretations and spiritual vitality. This role reversal is more than symbolic. It is a redefinition of currents of spiritual influence that have long been unidirectional. Documents prove that Western media has been slow to cover this transformation, perhaps because admitting that Africa is rising implies recognizing that global power structures are changing. Ignoring these changes may be an attempt to preserve a narrative that no longer holds up in the face of growing evidence of a continent on the rise. But history reveals that no matter how hard they try, the truth cannot be suppressed indefinitely. Evidence points to a continent that is not only rising, but that is beginning to influence the world in ways few predicted. When Africa fully awakens, it will not just be an economic or technological awakening, but a cultural and spiritual renaissance that will challenge old conceptions and open up new possibilities for the entire planet. The question is, are we ready for a world where Africa not only rises up, but redefines what it means to be a global power? The West's fierce resistance to the rise of Africa can be interpreted as a desperate effort to retain power in the face of inevitable change. For centuries, European nations and later the United States imposed their will on the African continent under the pretext of civilizing peoples they considered inferior. But in truth, what was hidden behind this facade was the fear that Africa, freed from its shackles, would resume its prominent role on the global stage as the scriptures prophesy. What few realize is that this is not just a geopolitical conflict, but a spiritual and cultural battle, where the attempt to suppress a prophecy is revealed to be an act of blasphemy. Reality shows that external interventions in Africa, often disguised as humanitarian or economic aid, are in fact maneuvers to keep the continent in a state of dependence and subservience. Fomented civil wars, orchestrated coups d'etat, and restrictive economic policies are evidence of an underlying fear. This fear is fueled by the scriptures themselves, which speak of an Africa that will rise up, an Ethiopia that will reach out to the divine, and an era in which dark-skinned people will be honored and respected. These biblical passages, often relegated to mere allegories, gain new life when seen in the light of current changes on the African continent. Facts reveal that whenever an African leader tries to unite the continent under a banner of progress and independence, he is often silenced or removed from power. Patrice Lumumba, Kwame Nkrumah, and Thomas Sankara are examples of leaders who dreamed of a unified and strong Africa, but whose dreams were thwarted by external forces. It turns out that these events are not mere coincidences, but part of a historical pattern of suppressing any attempt to fulfill the biblical prophecy about the rise of Africa. Evidence points to a new generation of Africans who are no longer willing to accept the impositions of the past. This generation is positioned not only to challenge established power structures, but to redefine the continent's role in the world. With a significant increase in education, technological innovation, and intra-African cooperation, young Africans are shaping a narrative that rejects imposed inferiority and embraces a future of self-reliance and global leadership. This movement is a reflection of the prophecy that cannot be stopped forever. Research shows that Western resistance to African rise is a tacit recognition of the continent's latent power. Impoverishment policies, trade barriers, and destabilization narratives are all strategies to delay the inevitable. But history reveals that no empire lasts forever. Just as Egypt, Babylon, and Rome fell, today's power structures are also vulnerable to the changes that are coming. The question that arises is, when Africa fully rises to its feet, how will the world react to this new global order? Will they finally recognize the error of trying to suppress a divine promise? As the prophecy unfolds, the real battle is not just for resources or territory, but for a recognition of the value and potential of a continent that has long been underestimated and subjugated. The truth is that the rise of Africa is not just a distant dream, but a reality that is approaching in leaps and bounds. The truth is that if Africa becomes the spiritual center of Christianity, as numerous prophecies indicate, it will represent a seismic shift in global theological power dynamics. For centuries, the Western interpretation of the Bible has prevailed, often shaping the spiritual narrative according to specific political and cultural interests. However, Africa's Christian roots are deep and significant. From the beginning, Ethiopia and Egypt played crucial roles in the spread of Christianity. Alexandria, Egypt was not only home to one of the first Christian churches, but it was also a center of theological scholarship that influenced the development of early Christianity. The Ethiopian church, in turn, has a legacy of resistance and preservation of texts that Europe later suppressed or rewrote. What few realize is that Africa's spiritual rise is not just a matter of reclaiming a historical role, but of reclaiming an inherent truth that has been systematically suppressed. This truth includes the recognition that many of the earliest Christian saints were African, and that over the centuries Africa has provided refuge and spiritual rebirth in times of persecution. The monastic tradition of the Egyptian desert, for example, influenced monastic orders around the world, and many early Christian thinkers, such as St. Augustine, were African. The impact of this revelation is profound. It challenges the centrality of European theological thought and opens space for a diversity of interpretations that reflect the cultural and spiritual richness of the African continent. Reality shows that as Africa regains its central role, European theology will need to confront its colonial past and recognize the value of African traditions. This won't be easy. Many Western churches will face crises of faith as the doctrines they have long held will be questioned. The idea of a Jesus who shares closer cultural ties with Africa than with Europe reconfigures established perceptions and forces a recognition of Africa's role in early Christianity. Furthermore, the Ethiopian Church's preservation of texts such as the Book of Enoch, which was excluded from the Western canon, raises questions about what else was lost or altered in the historical process of forming Western Christianity. The facts reveal that colonial arrogance created an artificial dependence between Africa and the West. European churches, in their attempt to civilize and convert, often ignored or disregarded the rich and diverse traditions already existing on the African continent. Africa's spiritual rise challenges these narratives of dependency, highlighting that Africa, with its unique traditions and interpretations, has never needed the West to define its spirituality. This revelation will lead many to re-evaluate their beliefs, but for those who seek the truth, it represents a liberation, a return to a pure and authentic form of faith that resists oppression and distortion. And so, as the world watches, the question remains: how will world powers accustomed to controlling the spiritual and cultural narrative react to an Africa that not only rises up, but rediscovers and redefines its rich spiritual heritage? African spiritual awakening is not just a challenge to the status quo, it is a promise of global renewal and transformation. How is it that a continent so rich in history and spirituality is now at the center of a global prophetic rescue movement? The answer lies in the rediscovery of the scriptures, which have long been interpreted from a distorted perspective. Black theologians, both in Africa and in the diaspora, are rescuing the Bible from a colonial filter that has attempted to erase or minimize African centrality in the divine narrative. They are showing that passages like Psalm 68:31, which mentions Ethiopia stretching out its hands to God, are not mere allegories, but literal promises of a future where Africa will resume its central role in the divine plan. What few realize is that Isaiah 18 and Zephaniah 3:10 are seen by these scholars as texts that speak directly to the rise of Africa. Isaiah 18 describes a powerful and respected nation, while Zephaniah mentions worshippers coming from beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, a direct reference to the continent's spiritual and political rebirth. This is not just a matter of academic interpretation, but of a practical transformation that is happening before our eyes. African churches are experiencing explosive growth, African spiritual leaders are gaining global respect and influence, and young people of African descent are rediscovering their biblical African roots, realizing they are central to God's story. The truth is that this rescue movement is changing the power dynamics. A people who understand their prophetic destiny are a people who cannot be subjugated. They do not accept narratives that place them on the margins of history. For many young Africans, this rediscovery of spiritual and historical identity offers a renewed sense of purpose and dignity. It is not just about resistance against oppressive structures, but about an active affirmation of your global and spiritual importance. The facts reveal that while African leaders and local churches are growing stronger, there is a growing recognition that Africa has never lost its central role. Indeed, the global power structures that have sought to suppress this truth now face a monumental challenge. The African rise is not only inevitable, but it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And this is perceived as dangerous for those who benefit from narratives of inferiority and submission. Evidence points to a spiritual renaissance that is spreading beyond African borders. This movement challenges the historical monopoly of Western biblical interpretations, bringing to light a rich tapestry of spirituality that has been ignored for centuries. The impact of this is profound. It redefines not only theology, but also global power relations. As Africa rises, it not only claims its place in history, but redefines what it means to be central in the divine narrative. The question that remains is, how will the world react to an Africa that refuses to be silenced? As the prophecy unfolds, what we are witnessing is not just a spiritual shift, but a transformation that promises to shape the future of the planet. The African awakening is not just a matter of faith, but a revolution that challenges and redefines the status quo. In the 21st century, ancestral prophecies about Africa seem to be being fulfilled before our eyes. Several African nations are uniting under a new banner of cooperation and autonomy. The introduction of its own currency reveals an unprecedented movement towards economic independence. Countries like the Gambia and Zimbabwe are exploring the idea of digital currencies, while South Africa leads with the rand as a regional reference currency. This step is not just economic, but a symbol of emancipation, a declaration that Africa is willing to challenge the supremacy of traditional Western currencies that have for so long dictated its destiny. Reality shows that the expulsion of foreign military bases is a reaction to centuries of external intervention. Countries such as Niger and Mali are taking decisive action to remove foreign forces, signaling a desire to regain control over their own lands and security. This change is more than political. It is a spiritual and cultural awakening. Western powers, aware of the potential for this resurgence, often attempt to sabotage these efforts by financing internal conflicts. These actions, however, only reinforce African determination to achieve self-sufficiency and peace. What few realize is that regaining control over natural resources is a critical component of this transformation. The Democratic Republic of Congo, rich in essential minerals such as cobalt, is renegotiating contracts to ensure the benefits of its wealth are felt by its people. The same happens with Nigeria, which is re-evaluating its oil policies to favor national development. Evidence suggests that these changes are not just economic, but reflect a new mindset of sovereignty and justice that challenges historical exploitation. Culturally and spiritually, Africa is exporting its faith and traditions. African churches are flourishing around the world, bringing with them a vibrant and authentic interpretation of Christianity that challenges the dominance of Western doctrines. African missionaries are increasingly present in Europe and the Americas, reversing centuries of colonial missionaryism. This movement is not just a return to the past, but a manifestation of a faith that refuses to be confined or defined by external paradigms. The facts reveal that as world powers realize this rise, their attempts to maintain control are becoming increasingly desperate. Documents prove that economic and political pressure is intensified in response to each step of African advancement. However, history demonstrates that when a nation is destined to rise, human obstacles are powerless to stop it. Africa does not seek the domination that Europe once exerted over the world, but rather a balance, a cure for the wounds inflicted by centuries of colonization and division. The question is, how will the world react to this new era of African Renaissance? Africa, as the cradle of humanity, is destined to show that its sacred essence has never been lost. Prophecy is not just a distant hope, but an imminent reality. When Africa rises, it is not just a continent that awakens, but a new vision for the world that challenges the old orders and promises a future of renewal and balance. The question is not whether Africa will rise, but how and when this rise will transform the world. The scriptures speak of a continent that will rise not with brute force, but with a spiritual and moral strength that will challenge established power structures. Reality shows that Africa's rise will not be marked by wars or territorial conquests, but by a silent revolution of ideas, values, and spirituality. The biblical prophecy that many have ignored for centuries is being fulfilled before our eyes, and this is not just a matter of faith, but of historical and social justice. What few realize is that Africa's true strength lies in its ability to unite past and present, tradition and innovation. Spiritually, the continent carries a legacy of ancestral wisdom that is an inexhaustible source of strength and inspiration. This wisdom is not just a relic of the past, but a solid foundation on which new generations are building a future that respects both their roots and their modern aspirations. African youth, with their energy and vision, are becoming the spearhead of this movement. They are globally connected, but deeply rooted in their local cultures, creating a powerful mix of innovation and cultural identity. It turns out that African spirituality, often marginalized or misunderstood, is re-emerging with a vigor that challenges Western narratives. This reconnection with authentic spiritual practices is providing a moral foundation that guides economic and political decisions. Community ethics, respect for nature and belief in human potential are values that resonate deeply and have the power to transform not just the continent, but the entire world. Thus, while world powers rely on their weapons and economies, Africa is rebuilding its future on values that are eternal and universal. Historical records show that the African continent has always been a land of unparalleled wealth, not only in terms of natural resources, but also in terms of culture and knowledge. This wealth has long been exploited and plundered, but the tide is changing. African resources are being redirected to benefit their own populations. Intra-African cooperation is being strengthened through initiatives such as the African Continental Free Trade Area, which promises to transform the continent into a single and powerful market. This economic union is a reflection of a deeper union, based on a common destiny and a shared vision of a prosperous and just future. Evidence suggests that Africa is becoming a center of innovation in technology, health, and education. With a young and increasingly educated population, the continent is positioned to lead in areas that will define the global future. Mobile technology, for example, is revolutionizing the way Africans communicate, do business, and access services. Education, in turn, is being adapted to respond to local needs with a focus on sustainability and community development. This integrated and holistic approach promises to not only solve internal challenges, but also offer solutions to global problems. The facts reveal that the rise of Africa is not a threat, but an opportunity for a more balanced and fair world. While former powers struggle to maintain an unsustainable status quo, Africa is building a new paradigm based on inclusion, mutual respect, and cooperation. This new era will not be defined by rivalries or hegemonies, but by a spirit of solidarity and interdependence that can pave the way for a future of peace and shared prosperity. The true face of the African uprising is, therefore, a promise of renewal for the entire planet. So the question that arises is the world prepared to embrace this new reality, where Africa not only rises up, but leads with justice and wisdom? What is the impact of recognizing that Africa is destined to be the center of the future, as biblical prophecies point out? Many are still surprised to realize that the continent, which for centuries was explored, enslaved, and plundered, is the same one that the scriptures promise to uplift. This recognition is not just a matter of faith, but a complete reassessment of our understanding of history, spirituality, and geopolitical relations. When we begin to accept this truth, we see that it is not just a reversal of roles, but a profound transformation in how we see the world. Africa, which has always been painted as the dark continent, is now revealed as a beacon of hope, a promise that is being fulfilled before our eyes. The facts reveal that accepting this prophecy implies a radical change in the way we read the Bible. No longer as a book that centralizes the history of the West, but as a text that recognizes the centrality of Africa since its beginnings. Verses that were previously seen as mere metaphors take on new life in light of current changes on the continent. The reality is that, by reinterpreting these passages, we are not only rescuing African history, but recognizing the dignity and potential of a people who have always been an integral part of the divine plan. This new reading transforms not only our spirituality, but also challenges the power structures that benefited from African exploitation and marginalization. It turns out that this acceptance also changes the way we see history. The narrative of an eternally subjugated continent is replaced by a story of resilience and promise. Historically, African achievements have been systematically erased or minimized, but now, with this new understanding, Africa reaffirms itself as a vital protagonist in the global narrative. Documents prove that African leaders, over the centuries, dreamed of a strong and unified continent. These dreams, often frustrated by external interventions, now find an echo in prophecies that promise an inevitable rebirth. Evidence shows that, by accepting this vision, we also change the way we see the future. Africa is no longer seen as a continent to be saved, but as a vital partner in building a more just and balanced world. Western powers, accustomed to dominating the global stage, are forced to reconsider their positions. This new world is one where cooperation, respect, and interdependence are fundamental values. The African uprising is not just a historical correction, but a moral adjustment that challenges the status quo and proposes a new paradigm of international relations. History reveals that Africans and people of African descent are not eternal victims, but heirs of a promise that is being fulfilled. This recognition transforms just the view we have of Africa, but also the way we treat its descendants around the world. They are seen not just as part of a story of suffering, but as active participants in a narrative of hope and renewal. The choice presented to us is clear: resist or embrace this change. But the prophecy makes clear that regardless of our choice, African rise is inevitable. When Ethiopia stretches out its hands to God, as Psalm 68:31 says, it will be a moment that no earthly power can stop. This powerful image symbolizes the fulfillment of a divine promise that defies the limitations imposed by centuries of colonization. The world will see that Africa is not cursed but blessed. The time to rise up has arrived, and with it, a new era of possibilities opens up. The question that arises is, are we prepared to accept and celebrate this new chapter in human history?